Now I want to spend some time reviewing the code that was generated for us. Consider this a guided tour of the Ionic code that the App Wizard just gave us. Back in my terminal, there's a couple of commands that I'm going to enter now that you might want to make note of. The first one opens Visual Studio Code in the current directory, and I'll do that with code dot being the current directory. And the next one is an option to Ionic serve that does not cause the browser to be opened automatically, and that's the -B switch. So while that's getting set up and running, let's go ahead and look at some of the code that was generated for us. The first stop is going to be the Ionic config JSON file. There's not much in here. We have the name of the application, an empty object of integrations, and integrations is like Cordova or capacitor. And you can see the type is Angular. Let's take a look at the index.html file. At the top we have a bunch of meta tags. Most of these meta tags have to do with how the application will appear on mobile devices. The Ionic team has spent years getting these right. I don't recommend you mess with them. Down in the HTML body tag, there is a single custom HTML element, app_root. That's how the app is created. So let's take a look at where app_root is defined. It's here under source app in a file called app.component.ts. The first thing to notice is that component decorator near the top. It defines some information about the component and how it should be rendered. Selector tells Angular what the tag name should be. So that's where app_root comes from. Its HTML markup is in a file called app.component.html, which we'll see in a moment. And its custom styles are in app.component.scss. At the top of the class are some variables. There's an array of pages, so now you know where those come from. Next are the labels that we can see in the menu below the list of pages. It's traditional in an Angular app to define all of the class level variables and fields near the top, followed by the class constructor, which is what we see here. In the parameter list to the constructor is where we can inject various services that the component will require. Platform, an Ionic service, provides various pieces of information about the device or platform the app is running on. The next two, splash screen and status bar, are holdovers from Ionic Native and is specific to running on physical devices, which we won't cover at this time. Initialize App is a bit of boilerplate that I'm going to ignore for now. ng-on-init is what's known as an Angular lifecycle hook. There are a bunch of them, but this one's used pretty often. Angular will call ng-on-init once the component and all of its children have been initialized. It's checking the URL of the current page to try to determine which page from the pages array is currently being rendered. Next, let's talk about those pages and how to navigate between them. All of the main application routes are defined here. Think of a route as a URL. The routing module defines an array of routes and describes the pattern of URL to match and describes which page modules get rendered for each. The first route has an empty string for a path with a redirect to field. This means that if there's no path specified in the application, it will default to folder/inbox. Next, anytime the route starts with the word folder/ followed by an ID or a page name, the application will import the folder module and follow that module's own routing rules from there. I promise this will start to make sense as we build our own app. Now let's open folder.page.ts and look at something a little more interesting. The folder page component doesn't have a lot of code in it. It has a constructor in which is injected an activated route service. This is an Angular service that lets you get information about the route that caused the page to appear. Inside the ng-on-init function, the page uses that service to get the ID or the name of that part of the route. That ID is going to map to inbox, outbox, etc. Now let's open folder.page.html. This is the markup, and this is where the real magic happens for this page. Most Ionic pages will contain an Ion header tag. This defines that fixed header at the top of the page. Inside of that is an Ion toolbar, a container for buttons, menus, titles, etc. To add buttons to a toolbar, we can use an Ion buttons tag. The slot attribute indicates where in the header the buttons will go. Traditionally, start is on the left and end is on the right. This is reversed in right to left operating systems. The Ion menu button is that hamburger menu we saw when we made the application narrower. By default, it shows and hides itself as needed. Next to the buttons is an Ion title with the word folder surrounded by two curly braces. This is an Angular binding expression, and it tells Angular to replace that expression with the actual value of the folder variable. Next is the Ion content. This is where most of your page's content will live. It contains another header and toolbar containing just a title. Finally, we can see an HTML div tag with another binding expression and a paragraph with a hyperlink in it. Believe it or not, that's really a good chunk of the functionality. Sure, there are a bunch of other files, but the ones I've showed you are the ones you really need to be familiar with at this stage. The rest will be described as needed. Now, before we leave this little tour, I want to do a couple of fun things, but I'll leave that for the next lesson.